I think no deal would certainly be better than a bad deal, and I think one of the mistakes that the government has made is to go into the negotiations and sometimes look a bit too desperate to get a deal. Whereas in fact, when you're going into important negotiations like this, you need to make it very clear to the other side that you're willing to walk away if necessary, not necessarily to be confrontational or to push away the prospects of a deal, but just to be upfront with the other side. Look, we're not going to capitulate, we're not going to agree to a deal on any terms, and if we can't reach terms, then it's something that we're prepared to walk away from. And it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. The truth is, it's in the interests of the EU to reach a deal with us. We've got a huge trade deficit with the EU. They sell more to us than we sell to them, and for all their posturing, it would not be wise if they, on behalf of all of the manufacturers and producers and businesses across the EU zone, were to fail to reach a deal. And that deal doesn't have to be one that keeps us in the single market. I think any deal that did keep us in the single market would be a betrayal of the referendum result, because the truth is the single market goes to the heart of what the EU is all about. And one of the things we wanted to do when we voted to leave the European Union was to get out of paying the £11 billion net in membership fees to the single market, being under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, having free movement and all of this sort of stuff, which we would be able to do if we were still part of the single market. And the key thing is as well, we need to remember that the British people didn't vote to leave the EU only with a deal. They voted to leave the EU full stop. Yes, a deal, if it's a good one, would be a bonus, but the people have voted to leave the European Union per se, and not just with a trade deal. And we have to make sure that we respect the wishes of the majority of people who voted to leave the European Union. Another point to remember is that we were members of the single market by virtue of the fact that we were members of the EU. So when people argue that actually we're leaving the EU but no one voted to leave the single market, well, if we're members of the single market because we're members of the EU and we vote to leave the EU, then by definition our single market membership goes with it. Now, if we want to have a debate at some point in the future about whether or not we want to rejoin the single market, then that's a debate for another day. But I think it's wrong for people to suggest that actually it was compatible to argue that we voted to leave the EU, but we can still say that we can still stay in the single market. That would also be a betrayal of the referendum result. In terms of any transitional deal, I think it was always inevitable that there were going to be good things and bad things, things that people thought were acceptable and things that people thought weren't acceptable. That's the nature of negotiations. I think we've certainly got further than a lot of people ever predicted we would. I think one of the things the EU did at the outset of negotiations, and frankly it's a part of how negotiations work, was to posture and to make some very bold statements about what would be acceptable and what wouldn't be acceptable, both as part of any potential transitional deal and any long-term deal. And I think already they've moved away from some of that stuff, as they inevitably would do. So whatever criticisms people have got, and I've got my own criticisms of the transitional deal and what that might look like, obviously depending upon whether or not there's a longer term deal agreed. The fact is that there is some progress and there is a move towards Brexit, and despite all of the efforts of people in the Remain camp, particularly the hardcore, to try and knock it off course, the fact is that there is that mood, I think, among most of the country to exit the EU in line with people's wishes, and there will be things within any transitional deal that we have to swallow, but that's going to be necessary in order to make sure that we get a long-term deal, and if necessary we leave the EU without a deal. So it's key ultimately that people understand how negotiations work, and that often things will be said by parties at the outset because they want to set out a particular position. But as the nitty-gritty of the negotiations get underway, people compromise and they make concessions. And from the EU's point of view, I think it would be very foolish for them not to make concessions, considering the fact that we do run a trade deficit with the EU. The EU sells much more to us than we sell to it, and its manufacturers and producers are not going to be happy if there isn't a long-term deal, because ultimately it's going to hit their profit margins and hit them in the pocket. So for all of the bluster and for all of the posturing, I think there is a clear desire among people in the country to make sure that the result of the referendum is respected and implemented. I saw the launch of the campaign for what they call a people's vote, which is really, you know, a second referendum in all but name, and the fact that they secured the services of a lot of lovely actors and launched the campaign in Camden in North London, and you have to really think about what their strategy is. The truth is, the referendum was won by the votes of the English working class. And the idea that the English working class are going to be persuaded by establishment politicians and actors launching a campaign in, you know, a very trendy part of North London, I think shows the type of reason that people voted for Brexit in the first place, because they thought that the establishment simply did not understand them and had no connection with their lives. And I think people just see the campaign for a second referendum, which is ultimately what it is, as an insult to people's intelligence. It's clearly an unashamed attempt to subvert the result of the original referendum and ultimately to overturn it. And one of the things you have to think of from a negotiating point of view is, why would EU leaders offer us anything decent as part of any potential deal if they thought that a no vote to that deal would keep us inside the EU? That seems to me to be an obvious question that people who support a second referendum simply haven't been able to answer. And actually, the demand for a second referendum was never there before the referendum took place. When the debates took place in Parliament around holding a referendum, when the vote took place, I'm not aware of a single MP who said, if we support the idea of a referendum, we then have to enshrine in law the right of people to have a say on any potential final deal. So this is something that they've decided to dream up only when the result went away the way that they didn't want it to go. And the problem is, I think, that the truth is that 17 million people voted leave because they felt that the political establishment in this country had stopped listening to them. And nothing proves their point more than that establishment colluding to try to overturn the result of the referendum. And I think that's why the polls show there's been no real tangible shift in people's views, that actually, you know, if they held the referendum again, then it would probably result in the same outcome. Because ultimately people don't like being ignored and they don't like being treated with contempt. And to their credit, even lots of people who voted Remain have said, look, the debate's been had, the decision's been made, let's just get on and implement it. It's only really a hardcore, the Uber Remainers as they've been labelled, who are coming out and saying, no, we need to hold a second referendum. In other words, they need to try to block the vote. So it's fun and games, and it's antics, and people, I think, can see it for what it is. It's an effort to undermine the result of the original referendum, and I simply don't think that is going to gain traction in those huge parts of the country where millions of people voted leave, because it shows that actually those people don't understand what it is that drove people to vote leave in the first place. And the interesting thing is also, since the referendum, much of the debate around Westminster and in the media has been about stuff that, whilst yes, it's relevant, wasn't necessarily the reason that people voted leave in the first place. Millions of people voted leave because for them it was about values, it was about democracy, it was about belonging, it was about community, and much of the debate has been around the technical stuff about the single market and the customs union and the Irish border and stuff like that. And of course that sort of stuff is important, but ultimately it's one for politicians and academics and journalists, and it doesn't actually speak to the discussions that are taking place in the pubs and the shops and the workplaces up and down the country. And people see that. They see that the politicians are not talking about their concerns after the referendum. They see that the media is not covering it. They see that actually many people within the establishment are trying to overturn the original vote, and people think, well, I'm not going to change my vote against against that background. So until the establishment learns why people voted Leave in the first place, I think they've got very little chance of changing people's minds. One of the things I've always found really weird about this debate is the way in which so many people who would think of themselves as progressive seem to have embraced the EU. I think there's a real misunderstanding about the true nature of the EU. Some people seem to think it's some sort of progressive, benevolent institution that believes in peace, love and harmony. And the truth is, actually, and increasingly so over recent years, it is a pretty ruthless institution, anti-democratic, which ultimately serves the interest of big business. The EU is pro-austerity, it's pro-privatisation, it's pro-market forces. You only have to look at the way the EU treated the people of Greece to understand exactly what its true nature is. It commodifies everything, you know, in terms of the single market and services and goods and money and people, and the whole thing is driven towards the interests of big business. And it just strikes me that many people who are supportive of it have probably not heard the alternative view and seen the true side of the EU. And you do have to ask why it is that you know, business people and rich people who are now backing the project to stay inside the EU are doing so. It's because they know ultimately it serves the interests of them and their group of people. So there probably does still need to be a wider debate about the true nature of the EU. It's an explicitly, in my view, an explicitly anti-socialist organisation, and it's always surprised me that so many trade unions decided to throw their lot in with the EU, when in fact, you know, in many respects, the EU has been responsible for undermining workers' rights. And this is really a case now, I think, of the establishment versus the people. Actually, if you look at the ranks of the establishment, both during the referendum and subsequently, that have lined up behind defending the EU, whether it's big business, the banking industry, the IMF, the CBI, etc., all of the main political parties. And yes, there were one or two mavericks on the Leave side, but actually it really was a case of ordinary people just going out and voting Leave, and they did it, I think, because they were being told to vote Remain by an establishment which had let them down in recent years and which had added a tinea to their concerns. So yes, it's a pretty ruthless organisation that doesn't serve the interests of working people, and more people on the left, more people in the unions, more people who see themselves as progressive really need to understand that. I think we can see that EU leaders have taken a pretty hard line in negotiations over recent times. Now, in some respects, you know, that's not particularly surprising, because if you're a senior negotiator going into negotiations, then you're going to set out your stall and make some very bold statements and posture and eyeball the other side, etc. But equally, what's interesting is people who ever thought of the EU as this sort of progressive organisation that was all about internationalism and cooperation and harmony are perhaps seeing that really the EU is a pretty ruthless institution, which is there to defend its interests and to defend the interests of big business, and actually doesn't really care for any other country outside of its particular zone. So, you know, it's quite interesting that people really wanted us to stay part of an institution that they felt was based on the principles of peace and coexistence and harmony and internationalism. Whereas actually when any country leaves, the EU has shown that it will be ruthless in its treatment of that country, which proves the point that it's not quite about what some people think it is in the first place. And the question, I guess, is why would you want to be part of an institution that would treat you in such a way just because your people take a democratic decision to leave it? You would like to think actually that the wiser heads would prevail and that EU leaders would realise that a deal is as much in their interests as it is in Britain's, and actually to sit down and work out a deal. Now, I still suspect that will probably happen because I think some of the saner voices inside the EU, particularly people who are not necessarily politicians or negotiators, will realise that the EU's interests are served by reaching a deal with Britain. And actually, why would the EU... There's a lot of talk often about Britain self-harm in terms of leaving the EU, but why would the EU want to inflict harm on itself by not reaching a deal when you know, we run a trade deficit with the EU and their manufacturers and producers really need our market? So I still suspect that there's a deal to be had. I suspect it will be a deal at the 11th hour, as these things often are. But ultimately, I don't think either side is interested in self-harm. It would be very unwise for either side to walk away from a deal when there is no reason to. If the EU were to decide to insist on terms that were completely unacceptable and unreasonable, then obviously that's something that we might have to do. But there's a deal there to be had if both sides want it. I think the idea that the votes and the views of young people are somehow inherently more valuable than those of older people is sinister and actually really disturbing and completely cynical and opportunist, because the vote didn't go the way some people wanted it to go. They think that actually what we now need to do is to extend the vote to younger people, to people who are only 16 or 17, for example, because that might get us over the line in terms of subverting the result of the referendum. And this depiction of Leave voters as older people and bigots and, you know, closet xenophobes and things like that is pretty disgraceful. I mean, these are the people, the older people, who have really contributed to our country throughout their working lives, people who have got a real deep well of experience in life, people who have raised families and paid mortgages and sometimes lost their jobs and been unemployed, and knows what it's, you know, what it's like to be out of work and to try to get your parent into a hospital for a hip operation, or to try to get your child into the local school, and to know what it's like perhaps to struggle to make ends meet financially. And the idea that actually, without disrespecting 16 and 17-year-olds, but the idea that their views, when they haven't been through any of those life experiences in most cases, yet they are somehow more entitled to cast a view on what the future of the nation should be and what is right for the nation, and actually not only cast a view on it, but that their view should be treated as more valuable than those of older people, I just find a really disturbing line of thought. And actually, in every other area of life, the law and politicians would treat 16 and 17-year-olds as not being old enough to do certain things, to go into a pub and buy an alcoholic drink, to buy fireworks, to buy knives, etc. To go into combat in the army. You can join the army, but you can't go into combat until you're 18. Yet all of a sudden, when it comes to deciding the future of your country, the entire political and economic future of your country, all of a sudden they are equipped to do that. It's a nonsense argument. It infantilises politics ultimately, and it's pretty insulting to older people who have really worked hard and contributed to this country. To dismiss their views as being worthless and irrelevant, it's pretty despicable. I think some of the treatment of people who voted Leave, both at the time of the referendum and subsequently, has been pretty appalling. I think most people who voted Remain did so for what they would see as good reasons, and subsequently have accepted the result of the referendum and just want the country to get on with it, and all credit to them. But I think there's a hardcore of people who have been completely hostile to the democratic decision and hostile to those people who voted leave, and some of the treatment has been quite atrocious. And it's almost as if some opponents of Brexit actually think that they are inherently better people morally than anyone who voted leave, and they question the integrity and the motives of people who voted leave. They can't seem to accept that actually people voted leave in most cases because they just thought that our country faced a better future outside of the institution of the European Union. And whilst we should aim to get on with friends and neighbours across Europe and across the world, actually being tied to the EU probably wasn't in our long-term political and economic interests. You can disagree with that, but that's why, in my view, most people voted leave, and also because they just felt that the establishment in this country had had a tin ear to their concerns over many years, and it was a way actually of making their political masters in this country sit up and listen. But the idea that actually most people voted leave because they are innately racist or bigoted or xenophobic, or because they've got ill intentions, or because they're morally bankrupt, is just simply not true. It's simply not true. And some of the sort of patronising arguments and the real sort of paternalism that we see in the return of, people didn't know what they were voting for, or we shouldn't have allowed people to vote on it because they were too ill-informed. Almost goes back to the Victorian ages, where people didn't think that working class people should have the vote in the first place because they weren't up to it and they couldn't be trusted with it. And I often say to people, this talk about the thing on the side of the bus during the campaign. If people really think that 17 million people in this country voted leave because of something they read on the side of a bus, then they've really got no understanding of what's been going on in their country for the last 20 years. That's the truth of it. So, people in favour of Brexit, I think, are taking that on the chin, and they have to take those insults and those brickbats on the chin and just carry on with it. But I do think it does give a reflection of the patronising and contemptuous attitudes that some people hold towards people who voted leave. One of the debates about the nature of the EU has been the issue of privatisation, and just how much in favour of privatisation the EU is, and the railways have always featured very strongly in that debate. I think there's a compelling case to demonstrate that actually the EU would not allow us to nationalise our railways, certainly not for the state to have a monopoly in terms of ownership, and that actually member states are under an obligation to open railways up to the market. For people to be able to bid, businesses to be able to bid and take over parts of it. And the case for that seems overwhelming. The RMT has always made it very clear that it opposes the EU in large part because of the inability of the UK to be able to take the railways back into public ownership. Now, some people on the other side of the debate say that's not the case. Well, I think there's an easy answer to it, and you have to question why the EU has never done it. And if it is the case that a member state can fully nationalise its railways in terms of track, in terms of rolling stock, in terms of infrastructure, then the EU simply has to make a statement along those lines. It simply has to say that the UK, or whoever it is perfectly free to take its railway system back into full public ownership. It's never made that sort of statement, and I think that demonstrates actually that isn't the EU's position, and that we couldn't do that even if we wanted to. And that plays into the whole debate about the nature of the EU and the fact that it is an institution that works in the interests of big business and is ideologically opposed to public ownership. You then look at associated arguments around state aid and the fact that there are very heavy restrictions on any member state that wants to come to the rescue of industries that might be in trouble, and the fact that there are very clear laws against state aid, and the fact that the EU is based around competition and works in the interests of the market rather than promoting the idea of public ownership and nationalisation.